All right, let's talk about it. Flying versus driving. You're planning a trip, right? And that little nagging question always pops up in the back of your mind. Which one is actually safer? We all have our gut feelings, but what happens when we push past the headlines and look at the hard data? Well, let's find out. You've all heard that old saying, right? That the most dangerous part of your flight is the drive to the airport. It's kind of what we tell ourselves to feel better as we're boarding a plane. But is it really true? Or is that just a massive oversimplification? The data? Well, it suggests things are a bit more complicated.
Yeah, a simple yes or no just doesn't cut it here. The real answer gets tangled up pretty quickly. And to really get to the truth, we have to unravel one really key idea. What do we actually mean when we say flying?
To get a clear answer, we have to start right there by untangling that word, flying. Because it turns out, just lumping all air travel into one big category, that's the single biggest mistake people make when they try to figure out the risk.
And here it is. This is the crucial distinction. The official data from the agencies that track all this stuff, they don't treat all flying the same. Not at all. They split it into two very, very different groups, commercial aviation and general aviation. And understanding this split, it's everything.
So on one hand, you've got commercial aviation. Think of the major airlines, those huge passenger jets you take on vacation. That's one bucket. Then, on the other hand, you have general aviation, which is basically everything else. We're talking private planes, corporate jets, the little planes used for flight training, recreational flying, the whole shebang. And keeping these two completely separate in your mind is absolutely vital to understanding the real risk.
Okay, so before we dive into all the aviation data, let's ground ourselves with a risk we all know intimately, driving. I mean, most of us do it every single day without even a second thought. But what does that daily risk actually add up to?
Just look at this number for a second, 39,345. That's how many people died in car crashes in the U.S. in a single recent year. It's a number so big it's honestly hard to wrap your head around.
And, this has been a problem for a very long time. As you can see here, way back in 1913, the U.S. had about 4,200 road deaths. By 2023, that number had just skyrocketed to over 44,000. It's a risk that's grown right alongside our total reliance on the automobile.
So how do experts actually measure this risk? Well, they don't just look at the total number of accidents. The standard metric they use is fatalities per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. And in a recent year, that rate was 1.20. Okay, just keep that number in mind. That's going to be our baseline.
All right, so we've got our baseline for driving risk set. Now, let's head back up to the skies. It's time to compare that risk on the road to those two very different worlds of aviation we talked about, commercial and general.
Let's start with the flights that most of us are taking. The data here is incredibly clear. According to a major transportation data review, commercial airline travel has a fatality rate that is effectively near zero. Decades of improvements in technology, training, and safety procedures have made it one of the absolute safest ways to travel long distances, period.
But what about that other category? The private planes, the corporate jets, the recreational flyers. This is where the story gets very, very different. Now, there is some good news here. Safety in general aviation is getting better. I mean, look at the table. The fatal accident rate per 100,000 flight hours has dropped from over 1 down to 0.65 in recent years. But the key takeaway is that this rate is a real measurable number. It's a stark contrast to the near zero risk of flying commercial. And this chart, well, it puts the difference into some pretty stark perspective, doesn't it? On the left, you have commercial airlines with a risk so low it barely even registers. On the right, you've got general aviation. And while that rate is improving, the safety gap between the two is it's massive. This is really the core insight of the entire debate, all in one picture. Okay, so let's bring all these numbers together. We've looked at the road, we've looked at the two different skies, so what's the final data-driven verdict on flying versus driving? Now, there is one last little wrinkle here. We can't do a perfect apples-to-apples comparison, and that's because the risks are measured differently. Driving risk is measured by distance, miles traveled. Aviation risk, on the other hand, is usually measured by time, so hours flown. I mean, think about it. A plane travels maybe 500 miles in an hour, while a car travels, 60? So even though the metrics aren't perfectly aligned, the overall safety picture is still crystal clear. So what's the final takeaway here? It really just boils down to this. First, flying on a major airline is one of the safest things you can possibly do. Second,
General aviation, again, think private planes, carries a much higher level of risk, even though it's improving. And finally, driving. It remains a pervasive, daily activity with a tragically high number of fatalities every single year. So, now that you know the real data, does it change how you think about everyday risk? The next time you get in a car or step onto a plane, will you see it differently? The data shows that our perception of risk doesn't always match reality. And you know what? Understanding that difference, that might be the most valuable takeaway of all.